Okay, hi everyone. So the object, or really objects we're going to look at for the Middle Kingdom are mandible bones from the Qubbet El Hawa Cemetery. And I put an arrow here to show you that the mandible is the lower part of the jawbone, as opposed to the maxilla, which is up at the top. So the mandible is when that moves. And so we're going to be looking at that and seeing what it could tell us about the Middle Kingdom. Just a reminder, we've looked at dental um, evidence a few weeks ago. And if you remember, we looked at teeth in terms of like scrapes and chunks and so on, and looked at the issue of dental cavities. And then we made guesses about what people were eating, whether it's meat or vegetables. And this time what we want to do again, we want to look at what the lower jaw can tell us. So first, now I know we're talking about the Middle Kingdom, but the evidence I want to talk about covers the first intermediate period, the Middle Kingdom. It also stretches into the next period, which is the second intermediate period, which of course we haven't talked about yet. So if you remember during the first intermediate period, it was a time of collapse for the central government. And if you remember, this was probably due to climate. We also have other issues. So the climate is getting drier, the Nile isn't flooding as much, and the nomarchs are rising up and getting more and more power. And this is probably, if you remember, we talked about Pepi II, who ruled for a very long time. He was probably losing control of the government, and this caused the governors to have more and more power. Okay, now let's look at what these jawbones can tell us. So I've taken this chart from the article I had you read this week, and what it's doing is looking at the ratio between strontium, which is an element, and calcium, which we all know about, in the bones, and in particular in the mandibles. These things are happening because of what we eat. So we eat things that contain strontium and calcium. Now it just so happens that when you look at the bones in the body that collect this and build up, it looks like the mandible is the place where a lot of this is happening. So this is why these researchers in that article that I gave you were looking at the mandibles. And what they ended up doing is giving these charts. And you know, I'm not a mathematician. I'm sure there's lots of you out there who know way more about math than I do. But they are looking at the log. And what happens is log is when you've got a really large number and a really tiny number, and you can't really compare them. So you do the log, and it's based on 10. It makes it a little easier to graph and understand what's going on. And the researchers ended up just choosing to look at adult mandibles because in children the bone is growing, the elements like strontium, calcium are being built up at that point. So if you look at only the adult mandibles, then it's usually set. Now, it's not so important to look at the amount of. So if you look at here what's going on, FIP is first intermediate period, MK is Middle Kingdom, and you've got the second intermediate period. Now what they're looking at are these levels. And so it's this chart that I really want you to focus on. So what you see in terms of the strontium, calcium, the log of these is that, oh, I can't draw a straight line all the way across here, but you can see during the first intermediate period that the ratio is lower, and it's much higher during the Middle Kingdom and the second intermediate period. And so knowing that, the researchers have decided that something was going on with the diet during the first intermediate period. And if you read through the article, they tell you that they also looked at the strontium calcium ratio in the soil. Because what might have happened is that people die, they're buried in these grave sites. It's possible that if the bone sits against the ground, that what was in the ground could be like built into not built in, sort of collected in the bone or sitting on the outside of the bone. And so what they ended up doing is also testing the soil. It looks like there was no difference. So the results are not related to the soil pH. It doesn't seem to be related to the meat or vegetable intake ratio. And they looked at that. They do know that alcohol consumption will affect the strontium calcium levels, but they didn't think that adult Egyptians living back in the first intermediate period, the Middle Kingdom, and the second intermediate period were drinking enough alcohol to affect these ratios. And so what they're really looking at here, and this isn't on the slide, is that, oh, actually it is down at the bottom. Food was probably imported during the first intermediate period. Remember, the central government has collapsed. If you remember when we talked about that last week, I showed you some of the texts that made it sound like things were sort of in a bad condition, like the Nile wasn't flooding, and some of these government officials were feeding the poor, they're trying to farm as much as possible. Now, we did talk about, the sort of structure of these texts, meaning if you want to make yourself famous, you make it sound like you're helping people. So it's possible that's what's happening, but it looks like the scientific evidence is showing that there were problems with the environment. So it's thought that the strontium-calcium ratios are different during the first intermediate period because food was brought in from other places. And that affected the mineralization in the jaw. And then when you look at what's happening in the Middle Kingdom and the second intermediate period, if you look at those ratios, they're almost the same. So it's thought that food was probably more stable during that period. And even during the second intermediate period, I know we haven't talked about that period, but what happens very, very quickly is that people from the far north, not Egyptians, come in and take control of the north, and it breaks down the central government. But if you're looking at the strontium calcium levels, it doesn't look like food issues or food was a big issue as much as it was during the first intermediate period. If you remember, and I put this on the slide here, it was drier. So agriculture was changing during that time. And if you look at some of the literature that was written during this period by Egyptians, they do say in some texts that they're eating food that animals would normally eat, like they wouldn't. So there are definitely some things happening during the first intermediate period that's different from the Middle Kingdom. And again, we're focusing on the Middle Kingdom this time. So the reason I wanted to look at this particular article is to show you that something was happening in terms of agriculture in the first intermediate period, and then it becomes stabilized in the Middle Kingdom and the second intermediate period. And if you've listened to my overview of the Middle Kingdom, it's one of the wealthier periods of Egyptian history, and wealth is all based on agriculture. So what can these bones or mandibles tell us? Well, what I just said, food is stabilized during the Middle Kingdom and remains stable during the second intermediate period, despite what happened during that period. So we've looked at teeth in terms of what they can tell us about diet, and now we've looked at bones in terms of what it can tell us in terms of agriculture and the economy, because obviously they're both related when you're talking about sustainability.